Welcome to the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel series. We are proud to bring together decades of cybersecurity experience from world-class experts, executives, and strategic advisors. We will explore the present and future of cybersecurity evolution, talk about compliance and regulation, best practices, emerging threats, and the impact on the IoT and OT device market.
Good morning, good morning, good evening, or depending where you are. I'm Evgeniy. I will be the moderator for the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel brought to you by Cybits. Today's topic is the impact of supply chain transparency in the medical sector. Very, very important topic. We have three great guests. I want to first introduce Suzanne B. Schwartz, Director of Office of Strategic Partnership and Technology Innovation in U.S. Food and Drug Administration.
Hi, good afternoon.
Happy to have you here. Nimi Ocholi, Senior Director of Product Security at Medtronic.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nimi. Ken Hoyme, Senior Fellow of Product Security at Boston Scientific.
Good afternoon, everyone. Looking forward to a good discussion.
Thank you, Ken. The requirement of software bill of materials, or SBOM, is leading to fundamental changes in software suppliers. In the medical sector, transparency and accountability are matters of life and death. I think we all can agree that the highest priority is not to put patient life in risk due to cybersecurity breach or failure. And software transparency is one of the ways to mitigate such risk. Let's begin our discussion. I want to bring a first topic to talk about changes in the medical devices for the last 10, 15 years. There was a lot of ways that it changed. Now they're all connected, they're all small devices, or in some cases we put them on our phones. And maybe, Suzanne, you can start the discussion and tell what do you see, what do you experience in this particular topic.
Thank you, Evgeny. I'm happy to start the conversation because you're right. Devices certainly have evolved quite a bit over the past decade in terms of their connectivity, their ability to communicate, and their interoperability as well with one another. They're not simply black boxes, right? If there's one thing that I want to highlight here where this matter really comes to light is during the pandemic, where there has been so much of a stress on the importance of being able to continue clinical or patient care, and not have that be disrupted, in spite of the fact that there have been many patients and caregivers who have had concerns or inability to be able to access care because of the stress on the healthcare system due to the pandemic. This has put a greater focus and attention on remote capabilities and remote connectivity of devices. And while we see that come to the fore or come to the surface very much right now, we can expect to see over the next years that this means of being able to render care to individuals if they're in more remote environments or environments that just simply don't have the brick and mortar tertiary care facilities, that there is going to be much more of a reliance or dependence upon medical devices that offer greater capabilities, what we would like to call FDA enabling technologies. And that really puts more of the onus on these enabling technologies to be more secure. But I really would like to hear what my industry colleagues have to say about this as well from their perspective. Ken, maybe you want to?
Yes, sure. I think there's another kind of shift that's happened that has been kind of a virtuous or a catch-22, depending on how you want to look at it, which is traditionally in the past when devices were limited in their connectivity, the frequency for which manufacturers were going to update their software was pretty infrequent. It was only if a safety issue showed up, which was relatively rare. As a result, I think manufacturers often had some very inefficient mechanisms to distribute software. They're very costly, like SneakerNet, sending a service tech out to each piece of equipment. As we've networked them for other values, as Suzanne just went through, we find that obviously cybersecurity vulnerabilities are becoming more and more an issue that we have to deal with. And as a result, we cannot update by SneakerNet, 5 times a year or once a month. It's just too inefficient. So we're adding connectivity for a remote software update. And so therefore, if we add connectivity to improve the remote software update, we have to update more often because the threat surface is bigger and cybersecurity vulnerabilities become an issue. So clearly there is a much more constant change and update. Certainly in the consumer devices, handheld watches, those type of things. Apple and Android and stuff have automatic update programs that have been there since the inception. So I think the medical device industry is in the process of becoming more efficient in doing that. And clearly, as we segue into our old topic about supply chain, every time one of those updates happens, there will be a change in the content of the software and therefore additional communication requirements around that. Nimi, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great call out, Ken. And I think just building on what Suzanne and Ken just mentioned, I think people need to recognize that the pace of innovation continues to rapidly change. And so even the term medical devices and consumers may be much broader than people have traditionally thought of or understood. Watches are quickly becoming medical devices. It's not just pacemakers anymore. You have capital equipment within hospitals that are getting more network, like Ken said. You have everybody depending on the cloud like never before and trying to really accelerate that remote presence that Suzanne mentioned. And so, unfortunately, I think sometimes the lens on what we define these things to be as ends up being narrower than it truly is. And because we don't appreciate that scope, then we're not able to do the appropriate threat and modeling and security analysis that will help us get on top of that threat, including the dependency on everything within the supply chain behind those new medical devices. And even when I say consumers, right, at some point, who had to care about what you're using to provide care was very small. Now, caregivers have to be involved, and there are many other stakeholders along that whole care pathway that have to be involved as they use these remote technologies. So just being aware that the scope has increased like never before, and therefore the diligence we have to do has increased as well, is probably a key takeaway I want people to be thinking about.
So with great power come great responsibility. If I want to start a company tomorrow, will have a medical device, maybe a cup that can manage my blood or something like this. What should I think about from cybersecurity and transparency that will be impacting me when I have a real device?
So I think if there's a connectivity surface at all with it, it really needs to be started from the conceptual phase of the device. It really, at that point when you first conceptualize, you start looking at voice of the customer, you start doing that, you need to consider the cybersecurity software updates, what its risks are. And in particular in this space, it's the connection between cybersecurity breaches and patient safety. So if a issue that is in that device can lead to a misdiagnosis, a delayed diagnosis, things of that nature, you can directly connect to a patient harm. And clearly, as I'm sure Suzanne will attest, that's the FDA's bailiwick is safety and effectiveness. So you really need to be building that in. Threat modeling is a emphasis that's happening. And I think from a software bill of materials, you need to be thinking about the software that you choose and what its life cycle is going to be and how you're going to be able to manage it in the field. Suzanne, you have your comments.
Yeah, so I froze for a moment and I came back on. I heard safety and effectiveness. That's the FDA's bailiwick. So, but anyway, so let me make a few comments here with regard to what you both have talked about. First of all, what consists of that consumer universe has certainly expanded more and more, because a decade or two ago, the medical device user was really very limited in scope in terms of who would therefore really be the consumer of that device. Obviously, as we've talked about, that universe continues to expand and to expand. And I think that what we're seeing right now with regard to, for example, even the empowerment of different stakeholders. Let's just take the healthcare provider organizations, what we call the HDOs, the healthcare delivery organizations, who, recognizing that in terms of being able to best manage the devices that are on their systems, really need to, for that asset management and risk management, need to really know what resides on their systems. So smartening up in terms of having information around SBOM, for example, before procurement or as part of the procurement uh, work that needs to be done, discussions that have to be done, so that they have done their due diligence. They have full awareness around what they are purchasing and actually putting on their systems, and whether various types of controls need to be put in place. I think that just changes the way that consumer stakeholder really views medical devices today and the connected systems differently than they would have perhaps 10 or 15 years ago. And then I do just want to come back to, a couple of other thoughts. Number one, I started off by saying, devices of tomorrow are enabling technologies. And I can't underscore sufficiently that, again, because of where we are today, we at FDA are thinking about how these can be great enablers in addressing health inequities. The health inequities that came to the fore, that we're all, seeing very, very clearly today. And once more, that puts so much more of the onus on the importance of cybersecurity. And then last, Ken, I think you mentioned, or you brought up the concept of threat modeling as really important, and that's something that FDA has taken to heart as something that really needs to be encompassed and incorporated and integrated into the entire life cycle of the device, from the time that the device is in its initial design and concept phase, so that we do understand what the potential is for adversaries or other mechanisms or means by which a device can be potentially compromised. And to that end, as you know, we've conducted some threat modeling boot camps and have released actually a threat modeling playbook as part of that process of really bringing it to the entire ecosystem.
Suzanne, you almost answering the other topic I want to discuss about what else FDA is doing. So it's great. We're going to continue to discuss about this one. Before that, I want to remind everyone it's a live show. Please ask your questions on YouTube. Jan and John, thank you for your questions. We will address your topics when we're done with the discussion. So please don't disappear and ask more questions. So then let's get back to you about FDA and learn more about what else you guys are doing from supply chain and what people need to know about it when potentially they provide information to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can go on for a long time here, and I certainly don't want to entirely hijack this conversation. But I think it's important to think about it, or at least I think about this from two perspectives. Number one, what we have been messaging, what we have been speaking about in this topic area of supply chain, and what we are doing about it. So, there's a history here, and I think that it is important to put this in context, that FDA began to do work with, an effort that the NTIA from Department of Commerce brought forth several years ago. I think, if I'm correct, it was either 2017, when that initiative started, and when, to the great credit of our ecosystem, and by that I mean medical device manufacturers that participated in this collaborative endeavor, healthcare delivery organizations and FDA that raised their hands together and indicated that we were going to be that first proof of concept around software transparency, around SBOM, in terms of being able to demonstrate its feasibility, recognizing it's first generation, but let's demonstrate its value and that it can be done, that it's feasible. And from there, moving on into our medical device safety action plan, where we called out SBOM as something that we would potentially be seeking additional authorities in. We incorporated it into our pre-market draft guidance in 2018 as well, for which we received a fair amount of comment, and just mentioned that guidance will be coming out again in 2022 and will underscore the importance of SBOM. Similarly, as FDA and Health Canada have been the conveners, the co-chairs of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, we issued in 2020, in the spring, that first foundational guidance that included the importance of SBOM. And right now we're on a second, I wouldn't call it so much an iteration, but a deeper dive document that looks at what does implementation of SBOM look like. And this is, again, an effort across regulators and the medical device industry on the international front. So stay tuned on that. With regard to, those are all areas that, again, through the years, we have been socializing or signaling its importance. In terms of actual actions, so, we have been presently leveraging information that's been provided in pre-market submissions with regard to third-party software. And that's part of the pre-market cybersecurity review. And what we have recommend is that information that, that's already spelled out or articulated into FDA guidance documents. That's the off-the-shelf software use in medical devices and the multiple function device products. Policy and considerations are good places for manufacturers to kind of start with regard to incorporation of SBOM into their pre-market submissions. And I'm going to stop right there because I think it's going to really be important to get the perspective from my industry colleagues here as to, what's happening, what is the state of play, but also what are some of the challenges that that industry is seeing. And just to mention also, because I think both of my partners here are well aware of work that's been happening within the healthcare sector coordinating council groups as well. And probably it's worth speaking about that.
Thank you, Suzanne. That's a great segue. I just want to say the FDA has been a great partner in this evolution of the space, like we've mentioned, and how rapidly it's evolving for all of us. I remember the 2014 guidance very early calling out, you've got to know what's in your software from origin to when it leaves the manufacturer. So in many ways, this isn't new. We're just trying to give it the appropriate focus in the way it's evolving. I'm glad you called out the international dynamics as well, because some of our companies are multinational as well. And we want to be able to go about managing this risk in a way that makes sense in a global way and not in a disparate way, depending on the geography. So we've been engaged in watching closely how that IMDRF work is evolving. And so I want to say thank you as well for the evolution that's happening there. And like you said, it really has been a story around collaboration and partnership in this space. I think the other mindset that's key to call out, and you mentioned it, Suzanne, is having more of a life cycle mindset. I think in the past, there were a lot of times where you do your threat model, you do your risk analysis, you get through regulatory submission, and then you hope from that point into eternity, everything will be fine. Now we're realizing that because of the nature of the threat evolving, where you have adversaries poking at these things in new ways and new vulnerabilities being exploited that may not have been identified during pre-market, there's got to be a holistic life cycle view in how you're taking the post-market feedback and ensuring that you're keeping up to date with these risks. The FDA is partnering with us in industry through many of those forums like the HSCC and the different work groups. There's one targeting supply chain cybersecurity as well, legacy devices, and many other important topics in this space. And I think I'm just putting a finer point on exactly what you said, Suzanne, that this is a story of partnership, and the way SBOM is going to be meaningful for us all has to be a team sport. It can't be done in a pockets or in silos.
I'll just jump on one point that Nimi said that I wanted to emphasize. I think is critical. When you look at some of the really fundamental properties of securing systems, is usually number one out of the gate is asset management. Understand what you have, because you cannot protect if you don't know what you have. Software bill of materials is a way to define in a more finer grain sense of what you have inside your environment. And I see the FDA's expectation of an SBOM at submission time as a proof of concept. If you do not have a list of what's in your device at the time it's approved, you're not going to be able to support it well. And so it's kind of a necessary precondition of working in the post-market world that you have this information, because the manufacturer needs to use it to maintain and patch, update, and understand what they need to be monitoring from a vulnerability perspective.
If I might piggyback on your last comment too, Ken, I think sometimes manufacturers would wonder, we've been providing soup in the past, what's the difference and why are we doing SBOM? And I think it's exactly what you said. Soup is good directionally in telling you what you have, but when you look at the contents of what you're expected to provide in an SBOM, it's an order of magnitude more precise and clear about what you're leveraging, what versions they're in, and even a sense of how old they've been around, and ultimately a directional cue as to whether you actually have a plan to manage those subcomponents over the life cycle. So at the end of the day, this transparency is, like you said exactly, Ken, if you don't know what you have, how are you going to manage it well over the long run?
So let's dive in more about the security part, because part of the security is also the architecture. If your architecture is done incorrectly or vulnerable potentially, then you may have big problems in your product. So Nimi, maybe you can discuss some of the things and the challenges you see in the architecture and how it will evolve for the next 5 years in medical devices.
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, I think part of the challenge here harks back to that reality of how quickly this world is exploding and evolving. When you think about that term medical architectures, it probably conjures up different views in people's minds, right? Medical devices have evolved. So in the past, if you come from my background, it was probably more a pacemaker or a neurostimulator or something that was implanted. But today, across the entire spectrum, you have implantables, you have external instrumentation, you have pumps, you have diabetes pumps, you have things that provide therapy or might be diagnostic just for capturing data to make informed decisions within the medical care pathway. You have capital equipment like O-arms, things that do MRI scanning, etc. And then you have cloud solutions now that all these different architectures are depending on. And the combinations that are happening within the space will continue to evolve in ways that people didn't think was possible. If you look at other medical trends that are happening in the world, the dependency on data, leveraging AI and ML, and how dynamic those technologies and approaches are, the dependence on 5G, on Bluetooth, on IoT and robotics, and so many of these trends where we're doing things that we didn't do 5 or 10 years before and didn't even have a concept of what we're trying to accomplish. All those architectures have an evolutionary pathway of the ways they want to provide more personalized care, faster care, care at a cheaper cost, and in a way that really helps all the stakeholders in the continuum, from the patients, from the clinicians, from the admin folks and the IT folks in those environments. And so as we design those architectures, we have to take a user-centered approach in how we ensure that our security risks are managed for all those stakeholders. As Ken alluded to and has been said before, right, the principles in how you do security risk management by and large haven't changed. And without going into the detail, I'll throw out TIR 57 as one example of where there's some standards in how you methodically think about managing risk through the life cycle. But at the end of the day, for whatever type of medical device and architecture you're working on, if you aren't thinking structurally through that life cycle of your plan, how you're appropriately going to do a threat model and keep it up to date to inform you where your gaps are, how you're going to control and mitigate those risks, build updatability into them, like Ken mentioned, so that the risks you don't see in future, you have a plan to mitigate. And then after you get it in the field, you get your regulatory submission, you go into the post-market realm, and the new insights that SBOM is giving you, you have a plan for mitigating those risks that show up in your architectures. If you're not using a methodical approach to try to think through that dynamic changes that are coming through these different architectures, you're going to struggle with keeping up with the changing expectations for everyone in the ecosystem as this evolves over time.
I think that was a great overview from some of the strategic things that are happening within that. I'll take it down inside the device in terms of the inside device architectures. There's a great paper that's been circulating, the 7 properties of highly secured devices from Microsoft. And in that is the recognition that to build a really secure device, you need a hardware root of trust. It has been traditional in the past that to keep costs as low as possible, people would purchase the least expensive processor with the minimum capabilities to do what the device needs to do. But in understanding that in supporting it over a 10+ year life cycle, there's going to be updates that might require more memory, more processing time. But fundamentally, if you do not have some kind of hardware root of trust to do a secure boot, you are vulnerable. It's really hard to manage those kinds of security risks in a different way. Finding passwords, fixed passwords buried in source code is the cheap ways that people have tried to secure things and done it badly. So I think we will see from the internal architecture. It's interesting, Windows 11 will require a TPM for you to do it. So they're moving to the point where the underlying hardware for your basic PC is going to require hardware root of trust. So,
hey Ken, I'm going to challenge you a bit, but ultimately agree with you. I think you're totally right that the hardware root of trust is a key factor as we go forward. But I'm thinking of the people who may not have any hardware-based solutions and are truly depending on purely cloud systems. You don't have access directly to that root of trust. But this is where supply chain becomes key, because even if you don't have it, behind everyone's cloud is a physical system that your code is running on. So if you don't have expectations for your partners built into your agreements and a life cycle mindset in how you're going to manage that risk over time, exactly what you said will happen, where one of your suppliers gets breached and you're scrambling to understand how to gauge the impact. So disagreeing with you in case you don't have hardware, but also agreeing with you in the sense that at the end of the day, it's in there and you have to have a plan for how it's managed, even if it's through an agreement with your sub-suppliers downstream.
So Bob's pretty good cloud service may not be, while cheap, might not be your best choice for it.
Exactly.
You say don't start your own cloud service tomorrow and put medical devices and software there. Oh, I guess my next idea of the business goes away. I'm not going to start my own cloud. Ken, how about we'll pick your brain about some of the challenges you see around SBOM that need to be solved?
Yeah, I think while we're stepping into a brave new world and it's necessary, I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to be facing is how we distribute these things. They are going to be in an electronic format. They need to be secured in a way that you can trust their authenticity. But I remember a talk from several years ago from one of the large hospital chains that they had north of 100,000 devices of 2,500 different types from 400 manufacturers in their system. Monitoring the SBOMs of all of those and getting updates from those manufacturers is going to require some kind of electronic brokerage or some nature of that to be able to be efficient. Hospitals just can't be going out and manually logging into every one of their device manufacturers' websites to find out if there's an updated SBOM. So while it is a necessary thing, I think it will create some of those kinds of challenges. So SBOMs have several different use cases. One of is when a hospital is purchasing a device and they want to understand what risks that come with it. That's kind of a one-off handoff in a transaction. The biggest challenge comes if we have an active breach going on, a WannaCry, and hospitals want to know what risks they have and things they're going to take. They're going to need to have searchable indexes of up-to-date information from all of their devices. Hospitals that are large, manage a large fleet of devices. They don't, if they are in the loop for distributing the software updates for things like infusion pumps that might sit in the closet when they're not currently hooked to a patient and rotate through the biomed department once every X number of months, they could have different versions of software throughout the hospital. And so how they manage and recognize.
You're kind of coming back to asset management as well. Very
Yes.
important topic.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think those are a couple of. Nimi, Suzanne, what other challenges do you see?
No, I think that you. I think you.
Go ahead, Suzanne.
I think you have highlighted them. The. Yeah, I mean, between the distribution in terms of updating the SBOM when patches are issued, presents a real challenge right now. And it's going to come down to various tooling solutions in order to be able to remedy or resolve some of these challenge areas. From FDA's perspective, I think that's where we see the importance of everyone working together. And I know I sound like a broken record around that, but none of the entities, stakeholders can really work in a silo in this area, because we need to really understand exactly how needs can be met, particularly when you talk about even, healthcare organizations. And there's just such a big spectrum, such a wide or broad spectrum is probably the better way to put it, in terms of the haves and the have-nots, and what they're capable of. I think that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all type of solution, and we're going to be going through some growth pains in terms of being able to figure that out. Nimi, what are your thoughts?
You stole the words right out of my mouth. I think that element of the diversity in the users who want to consume this information, and this is the many-to-many problem that Ken mentioned, where without some federated approach or model, it's going to be really hard to understand how we won't be inefficient in how we share SBOM information with those who need it to actively manage the risks that they see in their environment. And right, this isn't just a local problem, right? This is global, right? So for many of these products used in many different geographies, you have the same challenge of both the hospitals that are still new and not as savvy as the big players and everyone in between. How do we have good sources of truth that are efficient to leverage in how we use the SBOM material? So
it sounds like a digital rights management between different people to have access. What are the ideas or recommendation to manage the different SBOMs? Like a folder to manage documents. What can I do maybe you guys do right now?
I think it's a bit different for the same reasons that Ken mentioned, in that some of this nature is more dynamic than some traditional materials that have to be shared in a normal, typical digital rights management solution, right? I think you have many software versions which are evolving really quickly. And so this is where I'm just going to put out the plug here. I know Alan was on a previous version of this podcast, and without being plugged in closely to that NTIA effort that's still going on, they're about to kick off a couple of different work groups. One, for example, is regarding how do you manage SBOMs for cloud solutions. I mean, that's something that if you don't control it and yet you need to know the information, right, that's not something that you can do on your own. And so I think the power of the community that Suzanne just mentioned as well, that's very critical, is going to be very critical in helping people have a playbook in how they manage the way they do SBOMs with others in the ecosystem going forward.
And I think there's a similar challenge in the open source world, which is a lot of open sources used. Our whole Log4j we're going through, understanding which pieces of software you have that may have that embedded in it is a challenge. And while the SBOM effort out of NTIA is industry agnostic, and as Suzanne mentioned, the medical device hospital industry, the healthcare stepped up to do proof of concept. It's supposed to be able to apply to power companies and all the other different aspects, because this problem is universal. Whether or not the open source community will start generating SBOMs of what's incorporated. I remember one time evaluating one of our digital health products was looking at using a Facebook framework for a phone app, and according to the information on it, there was 350 different open source items that had been incorporated into that framework. So it can be a very daunting problem at that next level down. So it's we have areas that still need work. And again, a plug for the HSCC. There is also a vulnerability communication working group within HSCC that's kind of looking, I think, at the NTIA things and how do we do some of these communications.
Actually, I want to throw out a real use case study that's currently happening as we speak in the last week. So I just found out about a library called NPM, that this is a very interesting one where the owner of the library that's used to manage some colors and something very much like Log4j, they intentionally made the library weapon where the update that came up basically caused software that was depending on it, used by many commercial companies, to fail. And so just to your point, Ken, Log4j and some of the others might have seen inadvertent where someone else discovered the issue. Within an open source context, we now have an example that's clear within this last few days of somebody maliciously causing it to break. And back to what we've been saying, if your lifecycle process that's depending on the software is not able to take mitigations around if the library you're using disappears or something breaks, how are you going to make sure that that breakage doesn't cause a patient safety issue downstream? That's something that I think people need to really recognize that they're going to have to become better at doing that. Sometimes that might even include having local copies of some of those libraries that are not connected to the automatic version in the open source system that just gets pushed, and then you have the new version with all its problems. There really needs to be a maturity in how ecosystem players, MDMs, and other stakeholders, to your point, are managing their risk if we're not able to expect that we'll always have good inputs coming from the open source community.
We have a lot of great questions from the audience, and I'm eager to get to them as well. But let's tackle another topic and then go to the questions of the audience. And I want to talk about different SBOM formats of standardization and how they potentially fit to existing process. Suzanne, do you want to maybe take this one?
Sure, I'll start. I think the best place for us to start at FDA is that we're rarely, with regard to anything, prescriptive in terms of you have to do it this way, and this is the only acceptable way. And especially in an area that's rather nascent, right? Because there are going to be different approaches that are utilized, and we do not want to, in any way, kind of constrain industry that it has to be done, one way versus another. And right now, as I mentioned, I guess at the top, that information that we're leveraging with regard to pre-market submissions that includes third-party software in terms of the reviews that we're doing is often based upon information that we've already kind of put out in terms of guidances. But there are obviously lots of formats that can be utilized. SPDX, Cyclone DX, those are often spoken about. I think that those will further help us. They'll further ensure our ability in terms of being able to identify whether there is vulnerable software within medical devices or whether it's outdated software. But it's going to come back to also some of the discussions that we had previously around where we want to be aspirationally is with regard to automation and the type of tooling. So right now, I would say that what we're receiving is time consuming. It requires a fair amount of effort by a particular reviewer But aspirationally, where we'll need to get to is going to be of a more automated type of mechanism.
Nimi, can anything to add here?
Yeah, I just want to build on what Suzanne said and say, again, we really support the approach that the FDA has been using to really help the space evolve as it needs to. I'll give a personal anecdote. When I used to be a closer practitioner to some of this product security work, and I saw the update in 2018 that asked for SBOM both in your labeling and in an automated way that can be consumed by your partners. I was very thrown off, put very frankly, by their labeling expectations around it. And this is where, right, one of those things, when you learn the point of view that's driving some of these FDA questions, it can be very helpful and productive. I think when you fast forward and you think about things like the PEAK program and some of the other areas where the FDA has said, we need to be thoughtful of the people today that don't always have regular access to technology. Some of these products are patient facing, and you still want them to have enough information that will help them, even if ultimately the strategy might be automated or technology based one to consume the information over time. It's things like that I definitely want to call out around having a user centered perspective in how these things are going to be used is very critical, because if you don't have that, then we could run the risk of generating information that's checking the box, but not really helping us stay on top of the risks over time as we want them to. And so that would be the only thing I think for now, so that we have time for the questions. But wanted to call out that with a user-centered approach, that at least I see informing the expectations the FDA and more importantly, our stakeholders and patients and customers have in how they can stay on top of these risks and understand what's in the products that they're receiving.
Thank you.
I'll just do the briefest of ads, which is down more in the weeds. I'm hoping that as SBOM becomes an expectation, more and more of the build tools and things that we use in the development process will start automatically generating this kind of information, because there will be a demand.
Yeah.
Make it easy.
We have a couple of questions related to different SBOM challenges. So let's start from Chris, and he is asking about naming convention. Who wants to take this one?
I can start, and then I'll let Ken correct anything I say that may be incorrect. So again, just want to pull out and put out there the shout out to the SBOM community by way of the NTI work, which I think has now moved into DHS and CISA. But they do have a group that's focusing on naming and how we make sure that things are called the same thing, or there is some way of normalizing what something is defined as. Because Chris is completely right. In a world where you have many people using, in theory, the same software, but calling it different things, getting to ground truth is going to be very hard. And the example I'll give there is many people are using Windows in some way or fashion. And I know that that group has taken active steps to ensure that we have some players from the Windows ecosystem working with all these other players that have different points of view to try to come up with a naming convention that can then be sort of, in theory, a de facto standard. Like Suzanne said, we can't mandate that anybody does anything in certain ways, or we may have the law of unintended consequences. But within that proof of concept model and some of the evolution happening within that community, I think people are pressing and exploring the ways we can tackle some of these challenges, like ensuring that if it's a Windows 11 component, we have a way of calling it the same thing wherever we are, and versioning and talking about different versions within appropriately.
Well,
that's one area that I know that is being used. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, it's particularly complicated in that case because Windows issues various patch updates, and so it really is a version of Windows plus a series of what patches have been applied. So
exactly
complicates things. And again, there's multiple models out there about how versioning happens and how naming conventions are, but nomenclature is important.
Agreed. This is an interesting one from Dustin. More and more devices are basically require access to our networks because they may be on a cell phone or maybe they need wireless connectivity. What do we do with private data? How do we ensure maybe the manufacturer not getting more than they need for the information?
I mean, I think in the cases of cell phones, the compartmentalization as done by the underlying OS of the phone itself helps try to ensure that you're only permitting things that are appropriate, that appropriate encryption technologies are used in moving the data from the device to that. But in this case, the question also is, they need to be able to access the home network. Again, if we're piggybacking on a device that they, like a cell phone that has either cellular connection or they know how to connect to their local Wi-Fi, then you're kind of depending on that. If you issue them a device that's a standalone monitor of some sort that needs to be connected to Wi-Fi, you wrestle with the very broad range of technical skills that people have, and you may need to be thinking about what support mechanisms you have, either in terms of call-in or Geek Squad type things that they can call on to help them. But we have patients that want to see the software because they're really sophisticated, and my 94-year-old mother-in-law has one of our pacemakers, and she's not software savvy at all.
Yeah, Ken, you hit the nail on the head. That's why I kept harping on having a user and also patient-centric approach to how you do this work. We've sort of pushed on that model in general in traditional safety engineering and following normal design processes within medical devices in general. But I think when you bring that into the security realm, right, again, you have to do the work. Not doing the work means you're going to encounter some of these unintended edge cases when the product is in the field. And so being thoughtful about your 95-year-old mother or someone who's more savvy has got to go into your thinking. And if you don't have the expertise, I don't know how else to say it, but you need to find out how to get access to that expertise to help you ensure that your threat model is thorough and is thinking critically about the ways it can go wrong. Because like you said, Ken, just depending on your cell phone, but not understanding that if you do it wrong, you can build on a shaky foundation. All of a sudden you have the data breaches and all that information being leaked out in ways you didn't necessarily think could happen. And it comes down to that concept you alluded to earlier about security by design, privacy by design, and making sure that within your planning, you create the capacity to go as far as you need to in assessing those use cases and those scenarios appropriately.
I would also add that from FDA's perspective, we began, I want to say it was in 2019 when we had the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee meeting then in October of that year, focus on improving patients' understanding, raising their awareness and education around cybersecurity of the devices that they rely upon. And this advisory committee meeting yielded some really important insights for us and recommendations, many of which we're still working on a continuum. And one of the commitments that we made was to create a series of short clips of videos that would serve towards better educating and empowering patients and their caregivers of what they need to know, what they need to be looking for, what they should be bringing to their physician's attention if something seems not to be right, what they should be providing to FDA in terms of information, and a number of different resources. So we started off with a very kind of basic foundational video, but it is our intent to really build upon that very basic foundation of knowledge in order to better empower patients and their caregivers.
I think this is a very good security awareness topic to do, and maybe later on you can share the link. We can add it to the YouTube video in the comments that people can watch, because it sounds very, very important.
Sure.
We have kind of continued discussion about personal devices and how do I define a medical device? Is my watch a medical device, or it's a personal device? And
It's not. So could I jump in right now?
Yes, please, Suzanne.
Because I do want to just correct, Nimi mentioned something at the beginning, which just needs a bit of a correction, in that the watch itself is not a medical device. Let me repeat that again, because I know that is a common belief. The watch is not a medical device. It is the software application that is on the watch that has gone through the FDA review process and is considered as a medical device, and that is SAMD, software as a medical device. So this may be just pure, kind of regulatory speak for the, the questioner right now, but I do want to, make it clear that your Apple Watch is not a medical device. Apple might submit pre-market submissions as others might with regard to a particular.
We just lost Suzanne for a second, I think so.
Yeah, it will be back.
You'll be back in
I
a
do
second.
want to,
Yep.
while she's coming back, I want to thank her for clarifying. The intention was not to suggest that the watch was a device. And I think one mechanism the FDA really has to ensure that people appropriately gauge whether their product can be deemed a medical device is to do presubs with the FDA. And you can have a conversation around what your plans are, what your intention is, schedule time with the FDA, and appropriately scope where your solution and what you're trying to do falls on that spectrum. The FDA is very collaborative and willing to help you think through some of that. So, Suzanne, I was just saying thank you for that clarification, and it's making sure that people know they can have a conversation with the FDA to understand where what they're thinking might fall on that spectrum.
Right, and we've written a bunch of guidances on that I would, and we have obviously a public-facing website that provides a lot of information there for, for general public as well as for manufacturers or software developers.
So there is a second question from John about the potential data versus my personal information versus my medical data. It's an interesting question, maybe not watch related, but could be different device related, maybe my phone or something else.
So I think again, in whether it's a watch or I think that the same corollary happens with a cell phone. I know the FDA has been clear that an iPhone in the App Store is not a medical device, even if software as medical devices is distributed through it. And so obviously in designing the software on a so patient data medical versus health data. Okay, I'm rereading John's question in terms of we're talking medical devices rather than necessarily mobile devices. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, obviously the issue of privacy is while privacy itself isn't regulated by the FDA, privacy is regulated in most of the users that we are dealing with. So between HIPAA here, GDPR in Europe, we have to design devices that meet the expectations and the legal obligations of the end user. So understanding.
Sorry, go ahead, Ken.
But just understanding what patient data is necessary and how long it should be saved and where it should be transferred. There's very clear rules on how to both do something with privacy and also how to minimize your risk holding on to data that you don't need. Go ahead, Dean.
Yeah, just want to echo exactly what you said. And this is an area that people will need to build more capacity in their orgs to manage if they're not already thinking about it. Back to the call out on use of data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, right? As we move into that realm where you're providing algorithms that are doing new things, but the data that's associated with that is just as important. That line begins to blur on what your assets truly are. And so while in the past we may have cared more about the actual thing providing the therapy, in this new world, if those are leading to patient outcomes and could impact them adversely, they have to be a part of the story you're telling and how you're managing that risk appropriately. And so while you have the privacy regulations you need to cater to within each geography, again, the intent of what you're trying to accomplish and the building blocks that get you there are fully within the purview of the expectations that are being set and how you're managing those risks appropriately. And I know the FDA has had papers, they're having forums as well to help the ecosystem think thoughtfully about how we're going to manage that ecosystem going forward.
I'll just interject oh gosh, my brain just went. So let's just go to the next question rather than I try to remember.
So, Ken, we spoke about updates and patching. and it requires architecture. And we have a question from John about how do you actually design your network, DMZs, proxies, what do you do? What are the potential exposure can be done here? Not, don't want to exposure, but how we prevent exposure.
So yeah, I think obviously one of the voices as you design update processes that you have to listen to is interact with hospitals to understand what's acceptable within their environment. What are the kinds of rules they apply in terms of what is allowed to cross their firewall, how it can be done. So certainly there are security mechanisms. Again, your threat surface increases because you're having it in that connectivity world, but it is a necessary management tool. So that's just my earlier comment about the vicious cycle, virtuous / vicious cycle, which is connectivity requires software updates more often, which requires connectivity to make it cost effective. So obviously you have to establish what kind of rules are allowed. I've certainly seen in contract issues with hospitals about their rules. If you do need a VPN connection if you are going to reach into your devices from outside, it's going to be a more of a sensitive issue with the hospital than if your devices reach out to a very specific IP address, something that can be managed, and so that they can allow that access just to check whether software updates are available. So,
if I might build on your comment quickly, Ken, and again, pointing back to something you said, it's table stakes going forward that you have to have updatability in your solutions, because without that, we're going to have a legacy problem just like the one we have now. So there's no debate about that. But I think the question about how you do that well is also a good one, where you have to have good sources of trust, roots of trust in your ecosystem that makes sure that when you get an update, you actually know it's coming from you or someone that it was intended to come from. When you look at SolarWinds and some of those other issues that have occurred and how subtle it can be to ensure that that trust through the supply chain is maintained, again, it may be a challenge, but we can't ignore the fact that making sure that you understand the integrity through your life cycle, both from a supplier's point of view, the technology you're using, you need to leverage capabilities that can give you high integrity, and knowing that when you get updates, however you choose to do them, will be ones that actually came from you and not from someone else.
Very good topic. Thank you. We're going to address last question. I know there are more questions in there, so we'll collect them and we'll do our best to answer them directly or put a blog about it. And we had actually a couple of people wanting to know about this part, about what health delivery organization can do with medical device manufacturers and how it can be encouraged.
Right. So first off, HDOs do have leverage with regard to procurement, right? Procurement contracts. We know that there has been a lot of efforts towards coalition building in that regard, and that is outside of obviously FDA's scope. But with regard to FDA, where I started from at the beginning is mentioning that SBOM was and remains a topic area that FDA feels very strongly needs to be considered as part of a legislative mandate. And right now, where we stand is we have done a lot of speaking about it. We've included it in a prior guidance, draft guidance, a guidance that's not for implementation. It will be in the future guidance as well. But I think that it's a combination of that which can be encouraged through our own recommendations, as well as working with the medical device community and the HDOs. I think that the MDMs, by and large, recognize the value at this stage of having an SBOM and making and being transparent around the software to their healthcare organizations. And we are working in the direction of having that become just, mainstay, regular practice.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think the issue that's always a challenge in this industry is the big hospitals and the big MDMs are participating and aware of it and building it out. It's all those small mom and pop shops that may not have even heard that this is going to be a requirement yet and get surprised.
And to that point, right, that's why I want to echo Suzanne's comment about the HSCC as a forum, the Health Sector Coordinating Council, where based on the presidential mandate and the directive there, right, private and public partnerships are trying to drive good behaviors and ensure that we're getting the other stakeholders in the system that may not be as engaged to start practicing these capabilities that's going to make sure that the whole ecosystem improves and matures over time.
Awesome. I would like to thank everyone, especially the panelists that are joining and answering and bringing these amazing topics, and the people that are the listeners and the people that are going to be listening to this in the future. Amazing questions, very, very good conversation. Thank you for joining. Please don't forget to subscribe. There's going to be more panels like this. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome to the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel series. We are proud to bring together decades of cybersecurity experience from world-class experts, executives, and strategic advisors. We will explore the present and future of cybersecurity